When you build a gun in Escape from Tarkov, the lower the vertical and horizontal recoil numbers are, the less recoil that gun is going to have. While this is true, it definitely does not tell the whole story. And in this video, we're going to talk about why the recoil and the fire rate stats are the most misunderstood weapon stats in the game. I'm Jessekazam. Welcome back to another Escape from Tarkov video. If you liked the video, think about dropping a like, commenting down below, or subscribing to the channel. That stuff helps me out a ton. And I stream Escape from Tarkov on Twitch. All my links will be down below. I'd love to have you stop by and say hey. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so the premise for this video came from something that I just kind of started feeling as I was playing Escape from Tarkov more. Then I did some of my own personal research and started to confirm what I was feeling. And then we did some more kind of research and testing live on stream. And some of these examples blew me away and blew away a lot of the people in chat as well. And of course, we're talking about fire rate and vertical recoil and how they translate across multiple weapon platforms. These are pretty simple things, right? Like the lower the vertical and horizontal recoil are, the lower the recoil is going to be in raid. And for fire rate, the faster the fire rate means the more bullets you're shooting per second or per minute, and the lower fire rate means the less amount of bullets you're shooting per minute or per second. But the confusion and the misunderstanding starts when we start comparing a bunch of different weapon sets and weapon types together. So these numbers, these vertical recoil numbers, really are there to reflect more the specific weapon you're using. As those numbers increase, that weapon will have more recoil. As those numbers decrease, that weapon will have less recoil. You know, these numbers are talking about the M4. When we start reaching across and say, you know, this M4 has 62 vertical recoil and this mutant has 62 vertical recoil, that's when the comparison starts to break down, because they're different weapon platforms and have different base statistics and have different characteristics as different weapon platforms. Escape from Tarkov has done a really good job of modeling these weapons and making them feel pretty true to life as they would be in real life. And because of that, the guns feel different at their base with their base stats. And so we can't necessarily compare one-to-one some of these numbers, these arbitrary numbers like vertical recoil. You know what I mean? Just because this says 62 and this says 62, that doesn't mean that these guns will act exactly the same when shooting at a target. And we will actually see that in a second. But one of the main reasons for that is fire rate. It's not the only reason, but one of the main reasons for that is going to be the fire rate of the gun. So in video game terms, right, fire rate is kind of just like the DPS. The more rounds you can shoot, the more rounds you can hit, and the more damage you can do in a second or in a minute of, you know, sustained damage on somebody. And that is absolutely true. Assuming you're hitting all of your shots, a higher fire rate in a video game is just going to mean more damage that should almost always be, you know, desired, right? Well, just like in real life, guns aren't always engineered with the highest fire rate in mind. A lot of guns, like bigger guns, 7.62 guns or something like that, are engineered with a lower fire rate specifically to make the guns more controllable and have less perceived recoil. Now, I am no gunsmith. I do not claim to be somebody who knows everything there is to know about guns or firearms or anything like that. But as I understand it, a way for me to break that down, that we can explain why the lower fire rate means a more controllable or less perceived recoil, is because obviously if we're in semi-auto and we shoot a gun, boom, you see the gun goes up, and in this case up and to the left, and then returns pretty close to where the original shot was going to take place. Boom, and then it comes right back down. Well, the higher the fire rate means that whole kind of like shot goes up, you know, the recoil sends the gun up, and then you bring it back down. When you have an extremely high fire rate, guns like HKs or even some SMGs with like 1100 RPM fire rates, the gun doesn't have enough time to completely come back down before the next shot happens. And that's when you see that climb. And obviously every full auto gun is going to do that because every full auto gun is going to have a faster fire rate than the ability to shoot and then come all the way back down. But that's at least how, in my brain, how I kind of like rationalize and view how these guns with the lower fire rate are going to have a lower perceived recoil, because there's a little bit more time between each round for the gun to center itself, as opposed to something that just flies with super high fire rate. Now, you can mitigate that once again with you know, the attachments on the gun and bring the recoil of the gun down, and that kind of mitigates that, and you find a really good kind of like middle ground, or a really good balance of having the high fire rate and a really controllable gun. But The reason that I wanted to make this video is because a lot of certain types of guns get a lot of, quote unquote hate in Escape from Tarkov because they're viewed as, well, that you can't get the vertical recoil down. We've all seen the M4s and stuff like that with 37, 34. You can even get an unsuppressed M4 down to like 28 vertical recoil. We've seen those. They're expensive, especially if you don't have all the traders up. Those are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of rubles to purchase a single weapon. And then a lot of guns like the MDR, people are like, oh, the fire rate's low and the recoil's too high. Guns, a lot of 5.45 guns like RPKs and stuff like that. People trash on these guns because they have higher recoil. Well, I wanted to do an experiment and show how much fire rate is going to make a difference. So we have a bunch of guns here. Obviously, we have some of the most common calibers, some of the most common guns. The Mutant is a gun with relatively, compared to something like an M4, high vertical recoil, but this is still used a lot. And so this is kind of like the exception to the rule. People use Mutants even though they have higher vertical recoil because everybody knows that it's a really good gun and they are pretty controllable. So we've got kind of like a meta M4 here, something with good vertical recoil. But what we're going to start with first, the first experiment is showing these two guns. These are 5.56 guns that have identical vertical recoil, 62, 62. The horizontal is really close, 170, 172. It's also worth noting that ammo can sometimes play a part in recoil because it can have a plus or minus recoil stat. Well, this 55A1 has a +5 to recoil, so they're both using the same ammo. We built them out differently with attachments, but obviously to make them exactly the same when it comes to recoil, ergonomics aren't going to matter. And the fire rate is going to be the next big difference. 800 rounds per minute on the M4 and 650 rounds per minute on the MDR. So let's take a look at the difference between these guns. So we'll start with the M4. We'll put it on full auto. I will aim at the kind of far target down at the chest, and I will not compensate for recoil at all. Here's my mouse. So we started low. We ended all the shots up over the top of his shoulder, and this gun kind of pulled to the right. So full auto, same vertical recoil stats. We'll try and aim at the same spot. There's a little bit of sway here, and we'll do that again. So you can see the gun pulled off to the left, but look at where this gun put all of its rounds as opposed to the M4. They both have 62 vertical recoil. And this is exactly the point. This is what I was saying earlier, where the weapons and the lower fire rate and the feel of the weapon are not going to be a one-to-one comparison, 62 vertical recoil versus 62 vertical recoil. There was a much tighter group. And if I had done any amount of trying to control the recoil, if I was actually shooting at somebody from this distance, it would have been very easy for me to just pull off to the right and put all of these shots center mass, as opposed to with the M4, you're way up over his head. Like, look at the spray. Look at how high some of those bullets go and how low. And it'd be much harder to pull that down, especially if this target was moving. So that is a huge example of exactly what we're talking about here. And the next test we'll do is we'll run something that's pretty close to a meta M4. Obviously, this isn't meta. You could put a red buffer tube on there, but this is a pretty good representation of something that the Chads will be using towards the end of the wipe. This has 37 vertical recoil versus the 62 of the MDR. So we can try that test again. This is the same 30 round magazines and the same ammunition, 5.5A1. We're going to start, make sure we're full auto, aim kind of like at the bottom again of this target. No compensating for recoil for me. Now you can see this M4 did a much better job. This is exactly what I was talking about. The more you outfit something with attachments to mitigate that recoil more, then you can get the same result. But how much money did you spend doing that? We'll do this one more time with the MDR, full auto, no compensating for recoil. Once again, off to the left a little bit, but most of those shots ended up in almost the exact same place as the 37 vertical recoil gun. Now, that doesn't mean these are apples to apples either. Once again, I'm not trying to do some crazy formula for what's the perfect number for vertical recoil. What I'm saying is that Of course, in this situation with money as no object, this is the better gun, because even though they feel the same as far as vertical recoil goes, this does have the higher fire rate. So going back to assuming you're hitting all of your shots, you're going to put more damage on target. You're going to dump that 30 round mag sooner. But when you have to also take into consideration the cost of these guns. The MDR was like 50,000 rubles off the flea market. The suppressor's like 30K. This is a really bad foregrip. You can get this gun. You can actually get the MDR way better stats than 62. I was just doing this to compare to some of the other M4s, and boom, you've got something that's incredibly cheaper as opposed to meta suppressors, ergo foregrips. If you don't have the traders, a lot of the longer barrel, the handguard, all this stuff can get incredibly expensive versus something that's very cheap and controls and handles almost identical to this extremely expensive gun with the sacrifice of a little bit of rate of fire. And this has all been within 5.56. We can do the exact same thing comparing guns to other calibers. This is kind of where this whole thing started. You can take this Mutant, which also has 62 of vertical recoil, the M4 62 vertical recoil. The Mutant's got a 650 fire rate just like the MDR, and we can do the same thing. Now, once again, I understand you wouldn't normally have an M4 with 62 vertical recoil. You'd want to build it lower than that, but just to again show that the number does not translate identically across all weapon platforms. Once again, 62 vertical recoil M4 is all over the place as a gun, as opposed to the Mutant. We'll put it around the same spot, no compensation. Almost all shots landing center of mass. So again, fire rate, DPS, assuming you're hitting all your shots, a faster fire rate is always better. But for me, if I can control a gun with lower fire rate and hit more of my shots, if I hit 4 shots out of 30 of a high fire rate gun, that is less DPS than hitting 17 shots out of 30 with a gun that I feel like I control. Obviously, the M4 kind of goes crazy. This is why people build them with such low vertical recoil, because its base stats, it goes left, right, and really far up at some of its lower recoil stats. And we can do kind of the same thing with the RPK, which is another gun that gets slept on a lot. Also, by the way, the 7.62 BP that we shot out of the Mutant also has a +5 recoil stat. And out of the RPK, we're shooting HP, because the HP rounds, while would never really be used in game, also have a +5 recoil stat. So we're keeping as many things as we can the same. Also to show, the RPK also has 62 vertical recoil. Once again, as far as price difference, I bought this RPK for like 30,000 rubles off the flea market. The only thing I did was add this, and it just brought the gun's recoil down to 62 vertical recoil. I was like, okay, sweet. That's all we need to do. So that being said, same experiment, low, no compensation, M4 all over the place. Just make sure the RPK is on full auto, aim low, no compensation. Almost every single shot hits center of mass. So you can repeat this experiment with any weapon platform you want, any type of gun you want. And once again, I'm not saying that this is what would be considered an average M4 build. I don't think it is. Like most people build their guns in the low 50s to high 40s would be considered like a mid-range M4. I'm not saying this is the gold standard to use, but I just use it as that 62 mark as an example where this would be considered something that is borderline unusable on an M4 platform. Those same exact numbers are incredibly usable on an RPK, on an MDR, on a Mutant, on a 7.62 gun, and a lot of the other guns, like a lot of the other AKs kind of come in here. The AK-74N and M both have a 650 RPM, and the AKM and AK-103 also have a 600 RPM. So a lot of the different weapon platforms in the game, you would notice this difference. And it's totally up to you. If you've got, a 100 million rubles and you want to build out the best of the best gun and get the best of both worlds, the high fire rate and the low recoil, well then of course that is going to be a better option. And that's why certain things like vectors can overcome this, because you even look at something like an MP9. The MP9 has 49 vertical recoil, relatively low vertical recoil, definitely lower than 62 like some of these guns that we're using, and you would find that this would actually be relatively hard to control as well, because this has 1100 RPM. This is one of the highest fire rates. I think it is the highest fire rate in the game, and these can actually be pretty hard to control, especially if your target's, 15, 20 yards away, because the gun is shooting so fast, even though it has a relatively low vertical recoil. And that's why a Vector can kind of overcome that and become kind of like the God SMG, because with very minimal attachments, not even best in slot attachments, you're getting to 24 vertical recoil with a slightly slower fire rate of 950 RPM. 950 is fast, but slightly slower than the MP9. And now that's why the Vector is a laser beam, because you get the best of both worlds. And when we talk about the rifle calibers, there is a best of both worlds out there. It just happens to be a gun that's several 100,000 rubles. So if you're not a top tier player, if you don't have everything unlocked, this gun is just so much money for similar performance to something that's much cheaper and people often like to kind of dump on and say aren't worth using. So I hope that this helped. I hope that this kind of like opened up your eyes to what some of these statistics mean. They're almost always in relation to the same exact weapon at a higher or lower stat, and not something that we can cross over to all weapon platforms. The point of this video was not, once again, to tell you that this is a specific vertical recoil range or to overcomplicate it. The point of this video is actually uncomplicate it and say, take a gun, go in your hideout and use it. Does it feel good? Does it feel controllable to you? Well, then use it. You shouldn't be worried about stats. You shouldn't be worried about if I have this grip versus the shift grip versus the RK1. If the gun feels good, then use it, because once again, fire rate is king if you're hitting your shots. And I have found, especially early wipe, or if you're a newer player to the game, that these cheaper guns require much cheaper attachments, if no attachments at all, and feel just as good as far as how many shots I can hit on target as some of the more meta guns. The RPK, for really cheap, I could get this way down to like the low 50s, high 40s. And same thing here. I could get this into the low 50s with better attachments here. These aren't even nearly the best you can get these guns, and they operate really, really well. So I hope that that helped kind of unconfuse some of these stats. And really, I hope that it just got you excited to go in and try out some guns in your hideout and some offline raids and find some different weapon platforms that feel really good, that are potentially much cheaper than the meta guns. Thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to check out this video. If you like it, think about dropping a like, commenting down below, or subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Like we said before, I stream Escape from Tarkov on Twitch. All my links will be down below. I'd love to have you stop by and say hey. And if you're looking for people to play Tarkov with, our Discord community is an awesome place to be. That link is down below as well. Thank you again for stopping by, and I will definitely see y'all on the next one.